Welcome to the Ghost Show online, my fiends, booze, and ghouls. Your hosts, Seika Groves, Rachel Benter, and Ian Russell will discuss all things paranormal. Prepare to be afraid.
So today we are talking about haunted Edinburgh.
So the South Bridge vaults. The bridge for its time was an engineering masterpiece. It was 1,000 feet long.
Wow.
And it was built as a viaduct style bridge with 19 viaduct arches.
Mm-hmm.
And once the bridge was built, those who had financial clout suggested, well, okay, now that we've connected these two parts of the city and we have this bridge, why don't we form I guess you'd call it a shopping community. Let's get Edinburgh's first shopping area together. And so they started constructing these buildings in that Cowgate area,
right,
building up along both sides of the bridge. And what it did was it covered over these arches.
Which is quite common actually in the UK. Like if you're familiar, there's a lot of those viaduct bridges, and they build businesses right into the niches that were once those arches. And if anybody watches Coronation Street, even on Coronation Street, some of the bistros and the mechanics garage and all of that are built into these viaduct niches. Right, they make a perfect spot to put a business now, and a lot of storage units and things too that went into those. So,
yeah. So these businesses, kind of took over the archways, incorporated them into their building structures, and as you say, they were turned into like storage areas.
Yeah.
For these businesses, workshops.
Mm-hmm.
And out of the 19 arches in this bridge, 18 of them were incorporated, and there's only one today that still exists out in the open.
Oh wow!
And I've actually got a photo of it here that I pulled off of Google Maps Street View, and I don't know how well this is going to show up, but
yeah, we'll see.
But you can see.
You can see.
You can see that this is the last single arch, and you can see how the buildings on both sides have just taken over all the other arches.
Cool.
And,
so they built into and on the fronts of the old bridge.
Yeah, and so once it was all incorporated and covered over, they did construction inside, building passageways, turning the arches into vault rooms, as I say, to create their workshops. And the bridge was not waterproofed at all.
Oh,
so
wow.
Every time it rained, water would seep into these vaults and flood everything out and just damage and destroy everything these businesses were using the vaults for. And so eventually they were abandoned because of this. And in the early 1800s, with the Industrial Revolution coming in, that Cowgate South Bridge area unfortunately turned into the slums of Edinburgh.
Right.
And the conditions got really bad, and these homeless people moved into the vault areas because they had nowhere else to go.
Right.
And not only the homeless, but it also created a situation with, let's call the less desirable individuals.
Right, and I got to interject just because you might say,
Yeah.
but Burke and Hare were highly associated with this area. This is where they came and took some of their victims that they then murdered and sold off to the medical school, right?
That's
So
correct.
one
That's
of my
correct.
favorite gruesome stories of Edinburgh.
Yeah,
Burke and
yeah.
Hare. But they were very well known for frequenting this area for victims.
Yep, they were the body snatchers.
Mm-hmm.
But the conditions inside the vaults, just because of the construction, the way they had been turned out, in the warmer months, the vaults were just stifling. They were humid.
Right.
In the colder weather, they were absolutely freezing and damp. And it just created this horrible situation for these unfortunate people that
Mm-hmm.
were forced to move in there.
Right, to live in those conditions.
And a lot of that has created the paranormal aspect
Mm-hmm.
that is now within these vaults. And there's also a story that in 1824, there was a fire that went through the Cowgate area and Southbridge. And the story goes that people had fled down into the vaults to escape the fire. And with the ventilation, the smoke from the fire filled down into the vaults, and a lot of these people suffocated because the smoke was coming in instead of being ventilated out. The roofs of the vaults, of course, being rounded, much like an old 18th century brick oven would have been, created the same effect as a cooking oven, and a lot of the people, it's said, were just roasted alive.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's that area alone too. I've read a great deal about it, and I know when we were planning our tour, that was one of the areas that we were going to visit for sure, was that section, just because it's just got such a creepy old aspect. And it, that sort of area kind of juxtapositions Whitechapel in London, in terms of the conditions and the people, and just, the lack of humanity, not by the people there, but just of the general populace that didn't live in the area, not caring about, those people that were in that area. But certainly one of the really interesting spots in Edinburgh, and I'm sure, it's like us, right? When you live in a location, you've heard about it so many times, and you've probably been there if you have any interest in it. And people are like, oh yeah, that's not that interesting to us anymore. But, for those of us who haven't been and haven't been able to see it, these are the kinds of things that, we of course are interested in. I want to also mention another location that, while it's not a viaduct and it's not a bridge, it's Mary King's Close. And Mary King's Close is a place that we were going to go and visit. And it goes back to about 400 years ago, where it was a street. And I think the staircase in Mary King's Close is one of the most famous staircases ever photographed in the city of Edinburgh. It's, if you look it up, it's got, there's always a picture of laundry hanging between the buildings, but it's this narrow little, sort of street that goes up with a set of stairs. And if people aren't aware, Edinburgh is very hilly. It's actually built on an old volcanic crater. And so it's, it's a little bit like San Francisco or some other locations where there's a lot of up and down in Edinburgh. So you're upstairs and very steep roads. And if you're walking there, you're really getting a workout in Edinburgh, because it's, there's kind of an upper and a lower, and the city just moves up. And of course, my great going back at least 10 times now, grandmother, who was Mary Queen of Scots, Holyrood Palace, the castle sits up on top of the abutment there and looks out over the city. So it has really spectacular views. And we'll get to the castle because it's got its own haunted stories. But Mary King's Close is really cool because it was this area about 400 years ago, and it would have been a busy little area in Old Town. And of course, at that time, you know, you would be able to look up at the sky and, you know, see the sky and these buildings and very narrow streets. But it's interesting today because today it's actually underground. So it's named after apparently a prominent businesswoman whose name was Mary King. In the 1630s. So we're going back to essentially the Renaissance period still here. And so we have this area which is now underground and has a lot of, you know, urban legends around it. Again, supernatural things. And these supernatural sightings have been going on since that time period. So in 1645, the plague rolled through. We can relate to that. But, you know, again, we can and we cannot, because what we have today is certainly not what the bubonic plague was in 1645. And while, you know, people are suffering now, I think that back then, just with the lack of any kind of real medical knowledge, must have been terrifying to have something like that happening. But victims were actually quarantined and left to just die in the streets, and then they were covered up. And so this area was one of those sections that they supposedly put these victims and then they just buried it. And it was reopened again to the public in the 2000s. I think it was early 2000s, 2003, 2004. And it's become a really popular location now. And there's tours through there all the time. So depending exactly what the history, you know, what really happened there, just the fact that they ended up burying this location interests me.
Is that right? What they call the underground city?
Yeah, I believe that that's part of the underground. It's these you know, warren of small narrow streets that you know, ended up being buried. And yeah, and so now it's open again to the public, but it's just got such a strange history to it, just that little area alone. And you can only imagine that if they really did bury plague victims in there, and I'm not really sure how true that is, because if it was closed down for all that time, and then they didn't reopen it until the 2000s, there would still be evidence of bodies.
There's another location. It's called Greyfriars Kirkyard.
Oh yes, Greyfriars, yeah.
Also known as Greyfriars Graveyard.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there was another plague, came through 1568.
Yes.
And there were thousands of bodies that were buried in a mass grave in the location of what would become Greyfriars following that.
Great cemetery. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In 1879, several tons of human remains were dumped into Greyfriars, unearthed and transferred from St. Giles Cathedral.
Okay.
Because it was undergoing a restoration and an alteration at that time, and
Right.
They needed to remove the remains, and they were just dumped in mass at Greyfriars. Now, Greyfriars is, as you say, everything's on a hill. Greyfriars is on a hill.
Yeah.
But Greyfriars actually used to be down in a little valley. And of course, today it is not. If you go to Greyfriars, you're standing up on a hill and you can stand there down onto the old town. So why is it now a hill when it used to be a valley? Use your imagination.
That's it.
That's all I'm going to say on this. Use your imagination.
Yeah, that's how many bodies are buried, dumped, and, you know, used for fill.
Yep. And also in the 18th century, again, you had the body snatchers.
Yes.
Coming into the property, doing what they did, grabbing bodies, digging them up for medical research that they could sell to
to the medical
universities.
schools. And let me address that a little bit, because that's an area of expertise for me. As morbid and weird as it is, it's one of those things that at that time, when we think about body snatching or, going in and digging up bodies, these had to be relatively fresh bodies. This was not someone who had been buried and had been in the cemetery for a month or a few months. This was a matter of that day or a prior day. And how the body snatchers, these people would know that these bodies were there. They didn't hang around the cemetery all day, waiting for someone to be buried, despite what, some movies and things like to portray. What they did is what we do nowadays. The newspapers, if they could read, there was still obituaries being placed in the paper, but there were death notices as well. And in those times, much like wedding bans or marriage bans, death notices were also posted. So it was a good indication. You knew that somebody had died. And so then it was just do the math as to where they were going to be, and, how they would end up being buried. Some of them likely went in on a nightly basis just to look for fresh graves that had been, you see the earth had been turned over and then reburied. But Greyfriars is an interesting spot, because we have a few of those cemeteries ourselves in Ontario that people don't talk about very often, that have many, many, many more bodies in them than what we know about. And they buried in layers. So if you think about it, in the 1700s, in the 1600s, in the 1500s, where you had a wave of plague roll through, and at that time, that location was on the far end of town, away from a lot of people where they actually lived. So they would put them there. And then again, and the next time it happened, and the next time. So of course, each time they're doing this, they're burying on top and then on top, and they're adding, and they're adding. But it's not just bodies, they're adding soil as well to that. So you're creating these mounds, and I've been on some archaeological digs that have been like that, where we have found a body, and then we dig down a little bit more, trying to, extrude that skeleton, and we find out that there's another burial underneath that burial. And, with ground penetrating radar, you can see, like in some cases, there can be 4 or 5 layers of deceased people that have been buried on top of each other. So so Greyfriars is probably one of these places where ground penetrating radar would be an interesting
Oh, I can imagine.
Yeah.
I could just imagine. So continuing with Greyfriars, because there's still more to the story.
Oh, of course.
As to why it's so haunted. So in the 1600s, there was some kind of a religious uprising against the government. And there was, I guess we'll call it a civil war that kind of resulted from this. And there were 1,200 individuals that were imprisoned. And they were imprisoned at Greyfriars, which part of the grounds were turned into a POW, prisoner of war camp, using part of the grounds, and some of the tombs that were there ended up being these prison huts, prison cells for these individuals, which is just bizarre. There was an individual named George Mackenzie who worked within the legal jurisdiction at that time. And this guy was just I guess he was just a sadistic SOB, because he inflicted all kinds of torture on these POWs.
Wow.
It's terrible. And the irony of George Mackenzie is that when he died, He was buried in Greyfriars, and his tomb is located right behind the area where this POW camp
Wow.
is. You can still see the remains of the camp. The tombs are still there. He was buried right behind it. So how ironic is that? But
As they say, karma.
yeah, yeah. So anyways, I guess dealing with everything that he did, and it just created this whole paranormal atmosphere. Because what they call now the Mackenzie poltergeist
Okay.
is his energy just inflicting all kinds of crazy paranormal instances in the area. His tomb is called the Black Mausoleum, just because the stone has turned black through age, and there's just all kinds of paranormal instances that take place. And I've got a book here on the hauntings of Edinburgh.
Oh, nice.
It's called City of the Dead, written by Andrew Henderson. And I just want to read a little quote here from the book that deals with Mackenzie and the Black Mausoleum at Greyfriars. And it reads, "The Black Mausoleum seems to differ from Edinburgh's other haunted locations for two reasons. One is the frequency of the poltergeist sightings. The other is the severity of the incidents. The period between the first recorded sightings, meaning Mackenzie and what was taking place, was in 1999. And in the present, it has seen hundreds of documented attacks in the Black Mausoleum and within the POW prison area. Of these attacks, an astonishing 150 have caused the witness of the attacks to actually collapse. There have been sightings of a white figure, unexplained smells, auditory anomalies, including knocking noises, both under the ground and inside the tomb. Dead animals are found, unmarked, in front of the Black Mausoleum. People have complained that an unseen entity has pulled their hair, grabbed their legs, grabbed their arms, hit, burned, or bit them. One or two have even claimed to be possessed. Now, I'm not too sure about that, but as a result, that area has been exorcised twice, both times apparently unsuccessful. So it's the story of George Mackenzie and his hauntings is quite bizarre, to say the least.
Wow. Yeah, that's. I mean, it's like I said, I was so disappointed that we didn't get to go there, but I am, these kinds of things make me anticipate the day that I am able to get there and check out these things. I mean, Greyfriars Cemetery is really pretty famous. Just, it's got a lot of well-known Edinburgh people of note buried there. But of course, too, and I think as kids, or, maybe not kids today, but I know when I was growing up, Disney made a movie about Greyfriar Bobby, the dog, who spent 14 years at his owner's gravesite until the dog passed away. I think it was like 16 years old. But I don't know if there's any hauntings around that one, but it's just
and the dog is now buried in the cemetery as well, right beside his owner. And there's a statue and a plaque commemorating Boggy.
There is, and there's a statue as well that's on top of a drinking fountain that's nearby as well too, with the dog. And I think it was a Skye Terrier, I believe, is what Greyfriar Bobby was. But his owner,
I believe that there are some people who have seen a dog apparition.
Yeah, and so that was one of the things too that we had scheduled, was to take the guided tour through Greyfriars in order to learn about all of the interesting history and hauntings and cool things that were there.
Thank you for watching The Ghost Show Online. Join your hosts again next week as they discuss more tales of the supernatural, the paranormal, and all things spectacular. See you soon.